Okay, and I'll do a quick Twitter update. Let's see. I never actually remembered to share the link to the video. I'm just like, it's happening. Okay. Okay. And I know Julia read this one, so she's raring to go.
Yeah. Yeah, I did this one on audio and I feel like that was a mistake.
Oh no. There's a lot that happens in this one. Yay. Hello, Julia. Okay, I think we'll give like a couple minutes and then we can go ahead and start. Yeah, so was the narrator not good or was it just like a lot?
It's fine. I just think Frances Hardinge is better done on page.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I didn't get as many quotes down as usual.
Yeah. I know. I think I maybe have like 2 and they're not even really, I don't know, they're kind of like important because of what they represent in the story rather than like, oh, this is one of the best lines in the book. They're ones that made me think and feel things. Yeah, so kind of instead of that, like we can share any quotes we have, but I'm thinking more of like notable scenes or moments that stood out for us because I have a lot of those. But not so much individual lines. Yeah, Julia said she did audio, so she feels like she's gonna have to really dig through her memory for all the details, but she is here for the overall vibes. Yeah, I think this book is heavy on the overall vibes. More so even than some of her others, I think. Okay, so do we want to go ahead and get into the intro stuff and people can trickle in? So let's go ahead and start off with introductions. And I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself, just briefly talk about the kinds of things you do on your blog, and share an underrated book recommendation, just to kind of mix things up, especially for people who've been tuning in a lot. We want to give you some extra content. So go for it, Hana.
Hi, everyone. I'm Hana. I primarily blog at the moment, although not even that really. I do nothing at the moment, but I read a lot of different things, particularly fantasy, across all age ranges and most genres. And for a book, I thought I'd go with something that uses kind of horror for a purpose in a similar way, which is An Unkindness of Magicians by Kat Howard, which I would pitch as like Ninth House meets the Night Circus, but better. Which is about these like secret magic houses in New York who are having a once in a generation magic battle, and the things that throws up about like power and who gets to wield power and the things that people will do to hold on to power. And yeah, I would recommend it. And I haven't seen anyone talking about it really.
Yeah, I feel like I heard people talk about it a couple of years ago, but it's been a while and I've heard good things. I will also go back and link the books we talk about at the end of the live show. Okay, so hi everyone. My name is Kara. Obviously, you're here on my channel, which is Wild Book Garden. I also read very widely. The number of times I've done this and yet I still don't know how to sum up my channel is like ridiculous. But I'm very passionate about the importance of reading like all kinds of books. I also read very widely across genres, although probably fantasy and historical fiction, and kind of getting to contemporary as well are the ones that I read most of. But I also read a lot of nonfiction. I read some sci-fi, trying to get into romance, with like interesting results, which is on me, not the genre. Yeah, and as for an underrated book that I really want to share, this one just came out last year, but I still feel like the number of like ratings it has and how surprised I am that it hasn't gotten more traction, I think it still counts. And that is Sisters of the Neversea by Cynthia Lytic Smith, which is a Peter Pan retelling. And it's a middle grade book, and it's by a Muskogee Creek author. And I really like the way that Cynthia Lytic Smith handles some of the many issues in the original Peter Pan, because if you have read it, you know that it is not the best portrayal of Native people at all. And I feel like she does a lot with that while still making it a really fun and whimsical story that she kind of puts her own spin on. It's one of those retellings that I feel like would be pretty widely recommendable, because if you like the original Peter Pan, I think you're still going to like what she does with it. But if you don't like it, I think she fixes a lot of the problems with it. So I think it's good as a retelling. And I also really love that in this version, Wendy and Tiger Lily, or her name is just Lily in this version, but they're stepsisters. And I love their relationship so much. Like, they're so different, but they really balance each other. And the book talks a lot about like family and like forgiveness and how much people can change. And it's just really, really lovely. It's like one of those books that balances like the important stuff it does with also being a really fun and engaging story, which I feel like many books do. Yeah, so that's my recommendation. Okay, and then before we get into the actual book discussion, we wanted to mention when Hana and I first did our announcements, we talked about a like scheduling thing that would be happening at some point during the read-along, and we're going to be taking at least a 3-month break, starting with, so like we're not going to have a live show next month. We're going to be taking 3 months off at least. That is subject to change, and it's for scheduling reasons, but also because I don't know if you guys noticed, but the release date for Unraveller actually got pushed back basically an entire year. So we would have had to delay that part anyway. So we figure we'll just do a break now. And like I said, we don't know exactly how long it's going to be. It's probably going to be at least 3 months, especially considering that different websites show Unraveller coming out either in September or October. So we're not quite sure yet, but just keep an eye on both of our social media. And we will keep you guys updated. But you are going to have a break. So if you've been meaning to catch up on some of the other books by Frances Hardinge, it's a great time. Great time to do that. Yeah, because there's quite a lot. But I'll also mention this at the end of the live show for anybody who tunes in late. But that was one thing we wanted to talk about. And the last thing before we actually start discussing is I wanted to go over content warnings. So the ones that Hana and I came up with are grief, attempted murder, emotional neglect, binge eating and eating things that aren't food, smoking, fire, and then references to war, animal death, drowning, and suffocation. So just be aware that those things will probably come up during the discussion, at least most of them will. And I think that's everything. So we're going to jump into the actual discussion part. Thank you guys for reading with us. And thank you to those of you who tune in after the live show. We really appreciate that as well. Let's see if I catch up on comments. Yeah. So Julia was saying that she read it on audiobook as well, and that she's going to have to reread physically at some point because she kept thinking, wow, that's a good quote, and then let it pass her by.
Yeah, I've been tabbing the others so like extensively, so I'm going to have to go back and do this one again. Otherwise, my collection will be incomplete.
Yeah. I mean, all of her books, but I was thinking as I read this one that it is a really interesting one to reread, because this was only my second time reading it. Yeah, I knew this book was dark, but I didn't really process how dark until hearing that list of content warnings. Yeah, there's a lot. Yes, Julia. Okay, so let's just start how we usually do with overall thoughts on the book. If you would like to share a reading, you can. And Hana, I know that this was your first time reading this book. So if you have any thoughts connected to that, I'd love to hear.
Yeah. Well, I like surprising no one. I really enjoyed it. Give it 4.5 stars. It was my first time reading it, which I think was interesting because I think my experience of it was the same as what I have had with other of her books. It's just that because I didn't know where the plot was going, it was more pronounced than usual, in the sense that it took me a while to get into it. It wasn't until and I think this is the same with all of her books. At the beginning, when it's just the one main character going through difficult things on their own, I'm not as engaged, and it's only towards the middle and end when they join up with whatever kind of allies they've found, that I really get into it. Which was, because this one I didn't know when or if she was going to join up with anyone. I found it more. I felt that stronger than I have felt it in the previous ones, where I know where the plot is going.
Yeah.
But yeah, overall, I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed the themes of it, and like the horror in service of a theme. And I loved all the characters.
Yeah. Yes, I loved it as well. And I think you have a good point that like the beginning is very isolating, because we don't know, like poor Triss is really like all by herself in these really terrifying situations, and it is a while before we see her kind of join up with other people. As far as my overall thoughts, I also really enjoyed this one. I gave it 5 stars. Again, even though there were some parts, this happens with me sometimes, because some of her books I've given 4 or 4.5 stars because I'm like, oh, these are specific things that I didn't like or could have been done better. This one, like, there were a couple of things that I maybe would have, if I were being more picky about, I could have said, well, it's more of a 4.5, but like as a whole, it just feels like a 5-star. Because don't we love how arbitrary ratings are? I was like, this one is a 5-star, it doesn't matter. But it was really interesting to reread this one because there's a lot of things that read differently when you know where things are going. And I also really, really loved like all of these characters. I have like so many feelings about them. And I should have mentioned this at the beginning, but we are in non-spoiler territory right now. But that section is going to be a lot shorter than usual just because there's very little we can talk about regarding characters and plot without giving things away. So I'll let everyone know before we get into spoilers. But yeah, this section is going to be a lot shorter. And I agree with Julia. Yes, horror as a metaphor is way better than jump scare horror. Julia said 4.5 stars for her. It was weirdly paced, but at the same time, I can't quite pin down a moment that I think should have been cut. But the writing was stunning, and I love the relationships and themes so much. Yes. And I think this is right on brand because I never pay attention to pacing, and we know this.
Yeah, I think if Frances Hardinge has any weakness, which, you know, if she does, I think it would be in the pacing. But like Julia says, I think it's been the same with every book, that I think they are longer than they need to be, but I also don't know where the shortening should come from.
Right. And I think that's maybe one of the reasons why I didn't drop this rating like I've done on a couple of her books. Because, like, for example, there's one of the scenes involving the tram, like the first time that we see the tram, that like I was not nearly as engaged in that part. I was kind of like, okay, like I got it, let's move on. But at the same time, we needed to have that scene. So I think that's maybe why I didn't take points off, is because I'm like, I don't know what you would have done differently about this. Like, I don't have a suggestion of like how to improve that part. Yes. And as we've all been saying, the atmosphere and the spookiness was really great, which very much matches my cover of this book. Like, terrifying. Okay. And then one of the only non-spoiler questions I can ask is, I wanted to ask what you guys thought about the choice to set this book shortly after World War I. This is one of her most historical books, I think. This is like historical fantasy, but like heavy on the historical, I think. And I think that was a really interesting and deliberate choice. So I wanted to hear what you guys thought about that, about choosing to set it right after the Great War.
I thought it was interesting because I don't know why I thought that it was set like turn of the century Edwardian. I don't know where I picked that impression from because it's clearly incorrect. But
close-ish to the century, yeah.
But I thought it was really interesting because I know Frances Hardinge has said in interviews that she likes to set books at like times of change, which like this is definitely a big one. And I think the way that it lets her explore like grief and kind of collective trauma is really interesting.
Yeah, that was one of the big things I thought as well about this time period, or like the choice to set this book at that time period, is how it does highlight grief. Like nobody in this book knows how to process grief in any semblance of a healthy way, which is like a really big part of the story. And I think that makes sense what you said about her liking to set her books at times of change. Like that makes a lot of sense. And one of the other things that struck me about it is, which we'll talk about a lot more when we get into themes, but like the idea of certainty. And I think with the choices she made with the plot, it makes a lot of sense why she said it when she did. Let's see, Aowen says, I think it was an inspired choice, moving quite rapidly out of the lingering Victorian sentiments, but Trista's family are still so obviously stuck in the past. Yes, and I think it's interesting that we see with Violet's character how she's kind of like representing more of like the 20s vibe and aesthetic and I guess attitudes. And as Aowen said, that Trista's family are very much stuck in the past in terms of grief, but also in terms of like literally the way they interact with the world. Hi, Kier. Welcome. We're still in non-spoiler territory, so if that's something that you have opinions about, then that's okay. Let's see. I love the scene where the Shrike, yes, talks about how the creatures don't like the church bells because religion represents certainty. Yes, and I think that was a really interesting connection to the time period, which we will probably talk about more later. Yeah, that was one of the scenes I was thinking about as well. Okay. And kind of the only other thing we can really talk about, like we can't even really get into characters without giving away things about the book. So the last thing is just kind of general thoughts on how this family is portrayed, what that says about like family in general and like messy relationships. Like if we have any non-spoiler thoughts about that.
I don't know. I mean, I thought it was very real, as all of her relationships are. They're definitely a messy family.
Yes.
But I think they're like, I don't know what I'm trying to say, but all the characters, kind of, we do get like all of their perspectives and all of their motivations are kind of reasonable in, you know, at the beginning, everyone's a mess. And as the book goes on, you kind of see where they're all coming from. I think she does a really good job of kind of like, even though, especially the parents make some terrible decisions,
yes,
you can still really see why and where it's coming from.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things she consistently does really well is for almost all of the characters, it's like, I kind of hate you, but I understand why you're doing what you're doing. Like, yeah, and I think that shows up a lot in the family decisions.
And this book doesn't really have a villain as such. Which is interesting.
Or not a clear-cut one, at least. Julia was finishing her comment. After the war, it was less powerful as people had lost some of that certainty after losing their loved ones in the war. Yes. I agree with Aowen. Very bad parenting. Yeah, that pretty much sums it up. Even at the beginning of the book, like before you get into like the really specifically horrible choices, it's like, do you even like your daughter, like your younger daughter? Like, wow. Okay, so I think that's everything I have for non-spoilers. Hana, is there anything you wanted to mention before we get into spoiler territory?
I don't think so. Let's go for it.
Okay, so this is your final warning, everyone. We're now going to be in heavy spoilers from here on out because there is so much to talk about. But if you have to leave, then thank you for joining us. And let's start off with how about that plot twist? Like, Just like your thoughts and reactions to finding out what actually is going on with, I can call her Trista now. Thoughts on that? Did you see it coming? What was your reaction?
I did not see it coming. I like clearly there was something weird about her, but I didn't realize it was a completely different person. And I thought it was a really interesting device because you like Pen, you know, you want the real Trist to come back. You don't want her to die, but also you're so attached to this character. You don't want her to disappear either. And you know, I had no idea how that ending was going to play out.
Yeah. This is like one of the main reasons why I think this book is so fun to reread, because I knew going into this one, like that was one of the big things I had remembered, is that she's a changeling. Which incidentally is a trope I love, but I can't talk about it when I recommend this book because it's like the spoiler of the book. So I'm like, it's good, you should read it. Which always happens with Frances Hardinge's books anyway. But yeah, this one is really fun to reread because there's a lot of clues, and I am so impressed at the way that once you know this, you're like, oh my God, everything makes sense. But without knowing it, it still really works as a book because the scariness of when Trista thinks that she is the real Tris, of like not knowing what's happening to her, and how her like memories, like not feeling like her memories are her own. When we find out that she's not actually Tris, that makes sense. But even before that, it feels like somebody who maybe is ill or somebody who has had something else traumatizing happen to them. So like there are other plausible explanations. And then when you find out what actually is going on, it's like, oh. Which I also really love. I've read this a couple times in books, and I would like to read more of them. I am fascinated by changeling stories where you actually follow the changeling character, because that's not often something that happens. Like I feel like, especially in older books, like the point of the book would be you're following the human child who's like trying to get back to their family and has to defeat the like evil fairy child who like took their place. And so, of course, Frances Hardinge turned that on its head. Anyone said the first time I read it, I was heartbroken. Second time I read it, I was like, yay. Start finding out how much better than Triss you are. Yeah. And even Pen is like, I like you better than the other one. Can we just not bring her back? And it's like, Pen. Yeah.
Yeah, but like we get almost nothing of real Triss.
Yes.
Which is interesting. Because you know, like she's not painted as a very sympathetic character, but that's not her fault either.
Yeah. Yeah, and like the part where Trista says to Pen, like, the sister who ruined your birthday and the sister who was kind about the frog is the same person. And like, yeah, just like how messy people are. Julia said, I love Trista, my changeling daughter. It was so sad having her realize this and feel like she's a fraud, but her development is gorgeous and stunning and perfect. Also, is that how they spell Trista? Yes, that is how it is spelled in the book. Yes. Oh my God. When she, in her narration, when she starts like referring to herself as not Triss, like, it's like, you are a person though. Like, yeah. Just got me in my heart. And we're kind of already talking about this. So let's just talk a little bit more about Trista as a character. Yeah. Sums it up. Hana, would you like to elaborate?
I just
yeah.
I just loved her so much. And she, this poor thing, she has no idea what's happening to her, and she, like, her parents are awful, and Mr. Grayson's like nice 1 minute and then like trying to burn her alive.
Yeah.
And this poor thing, she's all alone. Her sister hates her, like, but
yeah. Yeah, I adore her and I want to protect her from all harm. Like, I really like how which this is also typical. Like, we always love Frances Hardinge's main characters. I think every time we talk about them, it's like, I just love them and want to protect them. But something I really love about them too is that some of them, definitely including Trista, they have a nasty streak. but that they're very aware of, and that they have to like work not to listen to. And I really appreciate that. And I appreciate how understandable their meanness is. Like that, those parts where we see from like kind of what Trista is feeling and how she's kind of like vindictively satisfied that she scared Trista's parents so badly. And I'm like, yeah, I'm satisfied too. It's like, you should scare them. They were horrible. So it's like, even the things, like, just she fights so hard to be the best person she can be, and she feels like she's not doing a good job, but she is. I just, yeah, I love her. Like the humanity of non-human characters is something I will always love, and I just think she's a great example of that. Anyone says Trista is so strong. She comes into the family in a time they really need her, and she fights so hard for them. Yeah. And something else I think is like incredible is how selfless she is about helping this family who has not been very welcoming to her at all. Yeah. Any other thoughts on Trista?
Well,
I'm not very coherent.
About what you were saying about how she fights so hard to be good, and it's the bit where she's like, I could eat Pen, but I won't. And then when Violet's saying, like, the reason you told me is because you're not going to.
Yeah. I know. I love Trista so much. Yes. I think that sums it up. Yeah. And just like how like her emotional like turmoil is so well written. Like it's like physically painful to like watch her go through all of this, and to know that she's like dying and that she's still gonna use her last moments to help somebody else. And I'm like, I love that girl. I think even by my usual standard, this is a very incoherent discussion of a main character. I would do anything to protect that leaf-filled child. Yes. Okay. We can come back if we have more to say about Trista. I'm sure we'll be talking about her throughout this. Let's see. Let's talk about Pen. So her younger sister. Thoughts on her?
Again, the same. And she, because Pen, I mean, she starts off horribly, but she's so young. I think I forgot while I was reading it often at times how young she is. And she just wants to be loved. There's no one there to love her.
Yeah, like when Trista has that like conversation with the dad, and it's like minutes before he's like, oh, how's Pen? And she's like, oh, you remembered her, did you? And I'm like, yeah, tell him. Yeah, I also like, my heart hurts for Pen so much. I had a really interesting experience with her because at the beginning, like knowing what I know, I'm like, yeah, your reactions are understandable, like why she would be so angry at Trista and like not trust her and all of this. And then there's a part near the middle where I'm like, you're being a little brat. Like, why would you? I was like, why do I remember liking Pen so much? And then by about halfway through, I'm like, I would die for you. Like, I love her so much. And like, I also kept forgetting how young she was, which is kind of part of her character. She acts really tough, but she's not. And like the part where she like gave Trista the necklace and she's like, this has like, so people won't know who we are. And I'm like, that's like really like, it seemed like something a little kid would do. And I was like, oh yeah, she's a baby.
Yeah. And she makes some really terrible decisions, but she's 9 years old and she has had no parental guidance whatsoever, or like any real relationship with anyone.
Everyone says, yeah, every time I read these books, I'm like, you're my new favorite Hardinge main character. And this changes with every book. Exactly. That should be the tagline for this book club. It's like, I cannot believe Pen won me over. We started this book with me thinking she was the monster. But by the end, I was like, this child. Yeah, Pen is a real little sister. When she's trapped out in the cold, yeah, no one can hear her. the part where like Violet says she's like stuck in winter and Pen like hugs her. She's like, "What are you doing?" And she's like, "I'm keeping you warm." And I'm like, yeah.
I think that was my favorite moment.
I just love these kids so much. Like, and here they are saving every grown up around them. I know, yeah. There were like multiple moments where I was like overwhelmed. I was verklempt. Because I didn't remember those little things. I remembered some of the big stuff that happens and how I felt about some characters, but yeah, I was like, oh, I got punched in the heart. Okay. Okay, so speaking of Violet, let's talk about Violet because I love her too.
Yeah, Violet, I just felt so sorry for Violet as well. Like she's so tough, but also she's hiding so much pain, and she like the way she gives up everything to help these two girls who she like kind of knows but doesn't really know and doesn't really have any relationship to anymore.
Yeah, I know. She's so complicated. But also I was gonna say also not, but I don't mean that in a bad way. It's like she does have this really complex like backstory and like the things that she's gone through and everything, but like she's also very simple in the way that she's like, I am ride or die for everyone who I decide is worth anything. Yeah, I really loved Violet as well, and like seeing her character so much, I think made the loss of Sebastian even more important feeling. I mean, because I think we could see from how it affects the family, like including Trista, like what a loss it was and what everyone is going through. But like spending so much time with Violet, that adds like another layer to it. And I remember the first time I read this book, I was convinced that they were going to be able to somehow bring Sebastian back because I had not read very many Frances Hardinge books at this point, so I didn't realize that was not something she tends to do. But when Trista's talking about like, oh, we have to rescue him from the winter, and I'm like, yeah, let's bring him back. And like, we can't, because that's not what the book is about.
Yeah,
but
I could absolutely see a version of this book written by another author where Sebastian does come back.
yeah.
But so much of the power of it is that he doesn't, and the characters, have to deal with that because that's what happens when someone dies.
Yeah. And like the part where they're staying with Jack's family and they're gonna like the sister or the mom has gone to like inform on them to get the reward, and Pen is instantly furious. She's like, I'm gonna go back and break their windows, and Violet is like, don't you dare. She's like, you don't understand what it's like, and like if they're doing this it's because they need the money. And it's like just she's so, I love Violet. I'm not very articulate about any of these characters, but Julia says the only character I love more than Trista, I would read an entire book solely about Violet. Forever Winter by Taylor Swift. Yes, I know. It was set up as a possibility, and if I had read more of her books when I first read this one, I would have known not to get my hopes up. But yeah, I mean, she does kind of get to say goodbye to him though, which like, yeah. Also, that moment when they're talking to maybe it's some of the Besiders, and Violet just says like instinctively, like without even thinking about it, she's like, these are my daughters. And Trista's just like, it like made her feel all warm inside. And I'm like, oh my God. Yeah, consequences of grief is definitely a big emphasis. Okay. Any other thoughts on any of the three characters we've like gushed about so far?
I feel like I've proved my the ability to talk about anything.
I feel like I'm doing an especially bad job at forming sentences instead of just like gushing my emotions. So I feel you. Yeah. Charlotte spoke for all of us when she said, these are my daughters. Yep. Okay, so moving into some of the other characters, do we have any thoughts on the architect? Because I actually do think of him as the villain of this book, but I do think, like you were saying, Hana, that like it's not. He's kind of one of those characters where like he's doing all these bad things because he has no comparable moral code. Like he's like things are just different in the Besider world, which not that it excuses his behavior, but like he just gives me that feeling of like sometimes those non-human antagonists where it's like he genuinely doesn't think he's doing anything wrong because he's like, well, you broke the bargain. I can do whatever I want to you. That's just how it works. So yeah, any thoughts on him?
Yeah, I agree. I like, as far as villains go, I think he's the closest thing the book has. But he's sort of a wrong things for the right reasons kind of thing, because
Yeah.
the Besiders have been pushed out of their homes,
Yeah.
which, and it's not their fault that they need somewhere to live. Obviously he goes about finding them a place in not the best way, but
Yeah.
you can see where he's coming from.
Yeah. I also felt a lot of sympathy for the Besiders. He was kind of the only one, but even him, it's like he's doing it for these other people.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, he's not a simple antagonist. I also think it's interesting. I found him a lot less scary than Mr. Grey,
Mm-hmm.
who we'll talk about too. So like there were scenes with the architect that were scary, but like as an antagonist, Mr. Grey creeps me out a lot more. Yeah, I also think the architect was really interesting because I think it would have been a lot easier to like just hate him and not care about anything to do with him if he had been doing these things for selfish reasons. Because some of it was like his cruel and unusual punishment was like because his bargain was broken, but like everything that he's doing about like tricking Trista's father into doing these buildings and like all of his like most of his motivation is to keep his people safe.
Yeah.
And like you said, it's not their fault that they don't have anywhere to go, and we see that a lot of them are not bad, they're just strange.
Mm-hmm.
And even the ones that you think maybe are dangerous, they don't do anything until they're having to defend themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Julius, well, the architect never tried to shove anyone into a fire that we know of, so yeah, there is that.
Yeah, I mean, it is like he put Trista into this family knowing that it would end in her death, and he had no qualms about that. So like, yeah, he's bad, but and when he was saying like you can eat pen, like he has no understanding of human emotions, but he's not like he's not just evil for evil's sake, I guess. And like yeah, like you were saying, when with the Besiders, when they're all coming into this town and they don't even want to interact with humans, really. They're not interested in taking over their cities or whatever, killing them or anything. They just want to find a safe place.
Yeah. Do we want to talk about Mr. Grey a little bit? Creepy.
Yes, classic Hardinge misdirection in that I should have known not to trust him, and yet
I know. I was like, oh good, she found a nice adult, and it's like you thought. Yeah, and I mean even the part where he's talking to Triss's parents and he's like, I can help you, but don't call me until you're desperate. And it's like, so, which is interesting because it's like maybe he wasn't fully committed to doing what he was going to do. Maybe he still had like a tiny amount of guilt.
Or he just didn't think they would believe him.
That too. Yeah. And you find out his backstory, and it is sad. But for one thing, it's like, okay, well, part of the fault is yours for not listening to your wife, or like at least at least not humoring her enough to like figure something else out. But like what happened to him is horrible, but it's like I'm still not sad about what happens to him. It's like, good, you can't hurt Trista anymore. Yeah, I don't know. He was like I think he was probably the character I was most conflicted about, because I didn't like him, and I obviously wanted him to fail in hurting Trista or trying to stop them. But I could see why he thought he was the good guy. And even Trista kind of recognizes that. She's like, from his perspective, I understand like why, because like he doesn't know, like we know, that Trista is a good person. Mm-hmm. So he's thinking that she's like a monster who is good at looking like she's not. Yeah. Me too, Julia. First time I read this, I was like, oh, good. She found someone to help her. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think this is another thing that I was saying about, like, normally in these kind of changeling stories, you follow like the human. In pretty much any other story, he would have been one of the good guys. Yeah. We would have been following him and maybe human Triss as they're trying to, like, defeat the usurper or something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's good.
Okay. And we talked a little bit about Triss, like human Triss. I don't have that many thoughts on her. I do appreciate that we see a little bit of her personality. Like, we still kind of get a sense for who she is and that she can change and do better, even though she's barely in the book. So I don't know if anyone had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I don't know if I have much to say. I thought the scene at the end was really interesting, where she says, like, I would have jumped off that train if you told me to. And it's like, yeah, actually, we don't know you at all. We only know you through Pen's perception, basically, and the parents' perception, all of which are highly unreliable.
Yeah, that's a good point, because when Trista pushed her, it didn't even occur to me that she would have jumped. I'm like, yeah, get her off that train. Shove her into the lake. Well, yeah, that's a good point. There's something about what Trista is going through and where she's from and who she is that is, like, especially poignant. Yeah, anyway, that's a good point. Triss is the reflection of what her parents need her to be. Yeah, I also like that we actually got to see Triss. Okay, I think those are like my character questions, which was like a big chunk of what we had to talk about. I wanted to talk about the otherworldly parts of the setting. So, like, we see the Besiders and we see the Undercity. And if we had any, like, thoughts on that. That was one of my favorite scenes, I think. That was just, like, just wild. And, like, seeing Trista and Pen, like, navigate it. Although it was very stressful watching Pen, like, go up and touch everything. I was like, listen to Trista. She knows the rules. So, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I guess it's like the kind of thing where, like, it's the, like we were saying at the beginning, like, the vibes are not really remembering the substance of it, having not taken down any of the quotes, because that's where I remember being like, oh, these are lines I want to remember, and then just not.
Yeah.
But yeah, I thought it was interesting that because we get to see, like, the community and the, like, the, that they're fully formed settlement, and but the, like, the vibes and the, like, creepiness of it was so well done, I thought.
Yeah, I also just always find it very satisfying to watch somebody go into, like, the other world, or like especially with relating to, like, fair folk and that kind of thing, and actually follow the rules. Like, I just really like that, instead of like, oh, I'm just gonna, like, eat some of this fairy cake. What's the worst that could happen? Yeah, I think this is a great way to put it. Trista is the animated doll, but Tris is the doll her parents have animated. And then also said that that Undercity scene very much reminded her of Diana Wynne Jones' work. That's a good comparison. Yeah, and how even when we're watching all of that happen, it is kind of scary. Like we don't know if we can let our guard down around these like Besiders, but as Trista learns more about them, she's like, oh, they're just people. Like they don't. They're scary because they're different, but she's like, I'm a monster too. Yeah.
Yeah, and like they don't want to hurt Hana and Tris either. Like they, again, like they're scary and they're scared for themselves as well. They only like everything that they want to do is out of self-defense.
Yeah. Something else I thought was super interesting about this setting is what a reversal it is. So like normally in stories that have these kind of like old world creatures who are faced with like human civilization, they always end up like fleeing to the countryside, you know, trying to find somewhere that humans haven't gone. And this was like the opposite. It was like cities were their safe place because they were so confusing and there wasn't any certainty. And they could, like, they had the architect who could make these like giant buildings to hide them in. I thought that was really an interesting reversal. Okay. Thoughts on the title, Cuckoo Song, and like the symbolism of a cuckoo.
Yeah, I was actually thinking about this while I was reading it because I didn't until somebody pointed out that Trista was a cuckoo. It kind of I didn't pick up on the connection at all. Which yeah, but I think it's not uncharitable, but like I feel like the connotations of a cuckoo are less kind than
Yeah.
the situation that it actually is.
Yeah, because she didn't know. Well, I guess like baby birds don't make the choice either. But yeah, no, I know what you mean. The connotation is like a lot more negative. But it kind of mirrors what happens with Trista's name, where she goes from thinking that she's Tris to being like not Tris, which is like really sad, and then to having her own name. So she kind of like owns it, you know? Yeah, I liked and this is an interesting title because it is kind of a spoiler, but you have no context for it, so you don't know that until you know what it means. Also, one of my favorite parts is right at the very end where the architect realizes that she has switched places with Tris, and the line is like, "Hello, Daddy," said the cuckoo, and I'm like, "Yeah, you tell him, Trista." Feeling for the cuckoo for once, yeah. Oh, yeah, that's true. She is kind of made like a nest. Sorry, Trista. Okay, only a couple more things to talk about. So we talked a little bit about the themes of the book already. Like obviously, grief is a big one. The idea of certainty versus uncertainty, and then obviously another big part of the book is like who is actually a monster, which is something that I just love. I know it's done a lot, but I never get tired of it. And also like identity and anything related to that. So like basically this is the free for all. Anything about the themes that y'all want to talk about.
Yeah, I thought the themes were subtler in this one than they are in some of her books, which was interesting. But yeah, everything that you said, and I think I think it all feeds back into what we were talking about at the beginning about the time period as well. The kind of the idea of like the world changing and certainty and how kind of everything was becoming more ordered and more uncertain at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah, I also really liked, which we touched on already, but the way this book talks about how people are mixed, like they're a mix of good and bad. And when Trista even says, I think it's to Penn when she's talking about the other Tris, she says you can't cut them into slices like cake and only take the good parts. It's like I just really liked that. I thought that was really interesting. Of course, in Trista's case, she's almost all good parts, but it's still a nice idea. Fear of dolls, yeah. Like we didn't really talk about the creep factor of this book, but I think this is like one of her creepier ones, like the dolls and like the things that are related to Trista not being a human, and yeah, there's a lot of creepy parts of this one.
Yeah, but I also don't think that the cover does it any favors.
Oh no, like this really sets you up to know what it's gonna feel like. Yes, that part freaked me out. That was one of those.
The whole section, the first time that she starts eating non-food things.
Yeah, it was like a visceral. I was like, oh my god, no. Like, yeah. I forget what my original question was because I got distracted by the dolphin. Oh, we were talking about like themes.
Yeah. As always, I thought they were kind of very thoughtfully and like complexly explored, because I just get a lot of different angles on it.
It was just sorry. I have started an essay discussion on dolls and Trista and Tris role reversal. Never apologize for discussion. I love it. Yeah, that was. I mean, those like physical details about Trista are just described so well, like her thorn teeth and like the weird like hissing noise that she makes, and the cobwebs, like crying cobwebs, is just like, because it's like when you first figure out, or the book tells you what's going on, it's like scary, and then by the end of the book she's like crying cobwebs, and it's like, oh, poor baby, someone give her a handkerchief. Like
yeah, and the scene with the eggshells.
Yeah, that was one of the specific scenes I was gonna talk about. Like that was one of the, like, so the things that I remembered from the first time I read this book, because it's been a while. I remembered that Trista was a changeling. I didn't remember anything about the architect, surprisingly, but I did remember Mr. Gray and what happens with him, and I remembered that scene with the eggshells. And it's done so well because it's another moment where like you think that Trista has found like a nice person, and it feels like things are calming down. Like her parents had promised not to take her to a doctor, and then everything just like blows up. Yeah, it's so bizarre. And because that's the moment when you find out exactly what Trista is. So yeah, I love that scene. Were you going to say anything about it? I'm sorry, I kind of just like...
No, just like shivers about.
Yeah, I looked that up afterwards. I was like, I had not heard of, or I looked it up this time. I don't remember if I did before, like the eggshell cooking pots, because I hadn't heard of that. And I did eventually find some stories about it. I mean, like with all folklore, I think it varies regionally. But I think one of the variations that would be in stories a lot is that, like, yes, that could help you figure out if a baby was a changeling. But the reason it would happen, at least in the version I read, was that like it was kind of similar in that like, oh, it looks so ridiculous, but the thing that happens is that the baby reveals that it's not actually a baby because they like speak in like the voice of an old man or something, and they're like, I've never seen this in all my days. Like it's very weird. Let's see. Julia said all the non-food stuff had me unfazed until the pincushion doll. Yeah, I really hate like the consumption of things that aren't food, but the one that like was really the pins.
Yeah, but it's also the emotional element of like after she's eating it, she's like she knew that this was a present from Sebastian and that like Tris, you know, meant something to Tris and
Yeah. Yeah, it's like even the spooky parts. There's like the emotional component. Yeah, Julia was saying that the eggshell scene is so vivid. When we were talking about it, she said it like reminded her of like a Russian like fairy tale almost. And I'm like, yes, it's very. I mean, everything. There's like so much of this book is about like the old world meeting the new, but then there's those little pieces that like it feels like this came right out of a fairy tale, and that's like, especially because it's like in this isolated cabin, you know, and yeah, I love that scene. It's like freaky and weird, but it's such a good one. It's the good kind of freaky and weird. I also really remembered. I think this was another scene that I actually remembered from this book, which is weird that it's not a bigger deal because everyone just kind of like moves on. But the scene where the people try to pull them into the projection screen, that freaked me out too. And then it's like, oh, that's just one in a long line of things that are like happening to these girls. So they just move on. Julia said she doesn't have any particularly deep thoughts to say, but the theme of a non-human character discovering their identity and humanity is never amiss. I agree. I will never get tired of it. Yeah. Okay. So, do we want to do, I know neither of us have very many quotes, but if we want to share any of the ones we do have, yes, Penn being in a silent movie. Yeah.
Yeah, yes, like I said at the beginning, I did this on audio and I didn't really mark many quotes. The one that weirdly stood out to me was guns only exist in movies in America. I don't know why that's really stuck.
Yeah. I know. I felt that viscerally. I was like, it's true. But also, ouch, Francis. Like, we know. I'm laughing so I don't cry. Okay, yeah, I only have like a handful, but one of them is when she's still going by not Tris at this point, but she's thinking about Mr. Gray. I think this is when her father almost burns her to death. And she looks at Mr. Gray and it says, with a deep despair, not Tris realized that he was a good man and that good men sometimes did terrible things. Like, it's very simple, but effective. And then, oh, this one, I love every time Trista stands up to someone, I just like want to cheer. So when she's talking to the architect, and I think this is when, yeah, this is when Trista gets scared because she thought she almost ate Penn and she like freaks out and she runs away. And then she's like, but I didn't. Like I was strong enough not to. And she's talking to herself. And she says, but you couldn't make me do it, Mr. Architect, Trista whispered aloud. You lost that game. I'm not your tool, and I never will be. I'm free, and I'm myself until my pieces fall into the gutter, and I'm not ready for that to happen just yet either. I'm like, I love you so much.
Yeah, I had similarly, the only other one I had was now there's nobody to judge me, to tell me about myself, nobody to impress, nobody to disappoint. Now is the time I find out who I am.
Yeah. And then, okay, I'm trying to figure out why. It's always fun trying to be like, why did I take a picture of this entire page? What was I going for here? I think it was, oh, okay. So I think the reason I took a picture of this is just the first couple lines, but really the whole like section is good. She's thinking about how she has to go rescue Tris, and she says, maybe later I'll end up choosing sides in the big fight, but saving people comes first. Because like that's like everything Trista does is guided by that. And she says, I have to free Sebastian's soul and let it escape from the snows, and I have to save my other self. I have to save Tris. For Tris's own sake, and for Piers and Celeste's sake. For Violet's sake, so she doesn't get sent to prison for murder. For Penn's sake, too, or she'll grow up knowing she caused her own sister's death. and for my sake, so that whatever happens, my life will have mattered. They don't deserve her.
Yeah, and we also didn't really talk about the fact that, like, if Tris had died, it would have all been Pen's fault.
It would have what?
It would have been Pen's fault.
Yeah. And it's like she didn't know exactly what she was agreeing to, but like it's your choices that made this happen. Yeah. Yeah. Everybody who made a deal with the architect, I'm like, have y'all never read a fairy tale? Like, you never deal with them. Eowyn shared, the scissors snipped with a slow, throaty crunch as if relishing every inch. Yeah, the scissors thing was creepy too. Like any like object that is not supposed to be animate becoming animate is like pretty freaky. Julia said the quote she managed to jot down was, all was perhaps, nothing was certain. Yeah. Brief but effective. Yeah, this is near the end. There was an invisible necklace of nows stretching out in front of her along the crazy, twisting road, each bead a golden second. Yep. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm so happy, like, that Trista got to go away with Violet, and like, I'm angry at Trista's parents for not wanting her, but I'm also like, you don't deserve her anyway, so it's fine. Yes, perhaps illnesses could be left behind, just like small, badly concealed china corpses. Okay. So, any other quotes or like favorite moments or scenes? Like, not necessarily favorite, like you enjoyed them, but like notable ones that stood out to you? Because I was talking about before that like most of the specifics were like not so much quotes in this one as like, man, that scene with the eggshells.
Yeah, just like every scene where it's Trista and Pen and Violet together. The one where we talked about when Pen wants to warm Violet up, and then I think again, I can't remember if it's Pen or Violet who gives Tris a hug and says, "Oh, is it Pen who says I'm going to hold you in so your leaves stop falling out?"
Yeah. Julia says, Frances Hardinge, give me the spin-off about Violet and Trista in the countryside that I deserve. Yes. Yeah, like I love that the three of them spend like basically the entire second half of the book together. Like the gang's all there for like most of it. Also, I mentioned this a little bit, but one of the most satisfying moments in this whole book is near the end when Trista is explaining to the architect that he's an idiot because she switched places with Tris. I love that. I love that so much. Yeah. Also, I couldn't remember how Trista was going to get out of her death, basically, because I remembered, like, I was like, I know that she's okay at the end, but I don't remember what happens. And then she like whips out that necklace and like puts it in the clock, and I was like, Pen saved her life. She didn't know it, but she did. Julia says, exactly, Hana. Every scene with the girls hugging is the best scene. It's true. Oh my god, yes, where Pen pretends to be hit by a car.
I'd forgotten about that.
I thought she was actually hurt, and I've read this before. And then Pen pops up, and she's like, "Yeah, you can drop us off here." And then Tristan's like, and Violet, like, Violet knows her.
Keep doing that.
Yes. Violet knows her. She's like, "Have you been jumping in front of cars again?" It's like, oh my god. And like, Pen is like, she's so reckless, and yet she also doesn't really think things through or understand what is going to happen afterwards. Like when Violet is like, well, we could just run away and like leave, but we wouldn't be able to go back for like whatever. And Pen's like, you mean you wouldn't come back? And it's like, Pen had never thought about running away where you didn't come back eventually. It's like, yeah, there was so much that happened that a fake hit and run was one of the more forgettable moments. Like, the fact that she regularly does it. Yeah. Pen is like absolute chaos. Like, oh my god. Like, I love her, but it would be so stressful. Like, this whole book, they're like constantly surrounded by like dangerous people and situations. And it's like having Pen there, like just walking into things, going up to strangers. Like, she's in the other world, like the Undercity. And she's like, I'm just gonna touch everything. And it's like, Ben, oh my god, you're all gonna die. I can't even imagine the stress of like being her big sister or like being on an outing with her.
Yeah, there was also the scene where Trista's interrogating the little creature who leaves the letters, and she like tricks her into asking the specific questions.
Yeah. Which like was frustrating, but I'm also like, Trista was so smart about it because she's like, well, I need the information. Like, I'm mad that it happened this way, but I'm not going to get killed out of pride, you know? Like, yeah, that scene was really good. And then like just another example of how Trista is such a good person, even though she doesn't always think she is she never gives up that like bird creature, and like she doesn't even give up Mr. Gray. Even though she thinks about it, she's like not willing to do that. Yeah. Even the part in the beginning where she's eating the rotten apples, I'm like, and she's like, it was like, she hoped she didn't see any half-eaten maggots in them, and I'm like, thanks, Tris. Yeah.
Yeah, I also love the bit where she's stuck on the roof, and Violet borrows that ladder. The guy's like, I thought you said your cat was stuck up there. And Violet's like, well, do you want me to leave?
Should I put her back? Like, yeah. And then when she calls her daughter again, she's like, my daughter sleepwalks, and I didn't want to have to explain it to you. Yeah. Just like, it's so heartbreaking seeing Trista be so surprised every time somebody does or says something nice to her. It's like, breaks my heart. Yeah, there was quite a few funny parts in this one. I feel like it was, when I think about the book, it's outweighed by like all the really heavy stuff, but there's like some good moments of humor as well. I think that's all the specific things I had written down. Anything else you guys want to talk about? Any like characters we didn't cover, or favorite scenes, themes, lines, anything about the book? This is our like anything goes section.
I think that's most. I really felt like the book was an attack on engineers.
Anti-engineer bias.
Which, like, honestly, fair enough.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, that was interesting. When you realize exactly what the deal was with her father, yeah, like how he got tangled up in like building these cities for people. One thing is I had a really hard time picturing the whole pyramid thing. I was really confused because I'm like, okay, they're gonna suffocate her, but if it was an actual building, there would be like doors and stuff. I'm like, so I guess it's like a decorative thing. But then how? I don't know. So how did that work?
Sure about that either.
I was like a little confused. I couldn't even figure out if like the pyramid was like on top of the building or if it was like a freestanding structure. But it's like if it was its own building, I don't think you could suffocate someone in there. So I guess it was like the thing that makes the most sense is I guess if it was like some kind of decoration that nobody knew had rooms in it, like space to suffocate someone.
Or like, yeah, I wasn't sure either, but I put it down to when Piers was talking about like buildings that had like spaces in them that shouldn't exist, that it was just some kind of like weird magic space.
Okay, that would make sense. Yeah, so like they can also do the opposite where you think there's enough space and there's not. Okay, that would make sense. Yeah, when Tris asks Trista or the other way around to write to her, and Trista's like, I can't promise I won't eat them. Yeah, it's like it's such a mark of like how far we come in the story that by the end of it, it's like, oh, Trista, like eating things you shouldn't again. Just want to say again how iconic Violet is. I love her. Yes. Yeah. And I love how like even though we obviously never meet Sebastian, and we're just hearing about him from Violet and from like the family and everything. It's still so clear how much they loved each other, and it just breaks my heart. It's like we never even see them interact, and I'm like, they really did care about each other.
Yeah, especially because we're a few years on from the end of the war now, right? It's not like immediately after,
right?
So, but it's still there, the love and the grief.
Yeah. This one dealt a lot with grief, more than I remembered. Like I remembered, I think that Sebastian was gone, but I didn't remember what an intrinsic part of the story his loss was, which I actually like, because like you were saying, it's like you still feel that, you know, even after a few years. And this is one of the many literary examples of a family where it's like, you guys are all handling this terribly separately, so at least if you talk to each other about it, you can maybe handle it terribly together. Yeah, I felt so bad for Sebastian, trapped by his parents' inability to contain their grief. Yeah,
and the bit where Trista confronts the father is like, you thought he would come back, but he can't. Like, this is all your fault.
Yep. Yeah, that whole like confrontation, I love. She's like, you tell him, Trista. Like, and even at the time, she's like, I probably shouldn't be saying all this, but what do I have to lose?
We also had a moment when they noticed the watch connection. I was like, wait, is the architect Sebastian? I'm glad that didn't.
Yeah. Oh my god. Yeah. I know. It's like sometimes there's red herrings where it's like, I can't even tell if this is deliberate or if you're just such a good writer that everything feels like a red herring. Like this could connect to this other thing. We don't know. Like the fact that necklace moment ended up being like a pivotal thing in the last scene. Yeah, the parents' inability to deal with it had a domino effect across everyone. Yes. Okay, so I think if that's everything, we're gonna wrap it up. I did talk about this at the beginning of the live show, but I want to mention it again in case we have anyone joining us late. But we are going to be taking a little bit of a hiatus. We did talk about this in our announcements. We kind of knew this would be coming for schedule reasons, and also because Unraveller, I don't know if you guys have looked at the release date, but it got pushed back basically a year. So it's either going to be coming out in September or October even. There's like 2 different dates online, which is always frustrating. But so we're going to be taking at least a 3-month break. So if you guys have been meaning to catch up on some of the other books that we read, then now is a great time to do that. Or if you've been following along, then you just have 3 months to, decompress and to gear up for our last few books. And just keep an eye on mine and Hana's like social media channels. We will obviously keep you guys updated. And we're not 100% sure how long the break is going to be, but it will be at least 3 months. So I think, am I forgetting anything? I think those are like
that's everything.
The main points. Yeah. So this is our we're actually much farther than halfway, but this is kind of our intermission, I guess, in our read along. So thank you guys so much for reading along with us. This has been a joy. We love spreading the joy of Frances Hardinge far and wide. So thank you for being here for that. Yeah. And
thank you to everyone.
Yeah. And we'll see you guys in a few months, and TBD. Yes, Path to Classics. That one will be coming soon as well. Our next one for that. So, all right. We will miss you guys as well, but we will see you in a few months. And thanks again for reading with us. Bye.